I am Maya. I am 33 years old and the founder of a multi-million-dollar estate management firm. But to my family, I was always just the disappointment who cleaned houses. Last Saturday at my sister Chloe's engagement dinner, my mother decided to humiliate me in front of the groom's wealthy family by announcing my supposed failure to the entire room. She wanted to elevate my sister by crushing me. What she did not know was that the groom's billionaire mother was actually my biggest client. When the truth came out, it shattered my family's perfect illusion and triggered a chain of events that left them begging for my help. Before I share exactly how I destroyed their pristine facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are dealing with. Growing up in a status-obsessed household in Atlanta, my parents Helen and Thomas made one thing perfectly clear. Chloe was the star, and I was the stagehand. Chloe was 35, a public relations executive whose greatest talent was manipulating our parents into funding her lavish lifestyle. I had moved away at 19 after they drained my college savings to bail out Chloe's failed fashion boutique. Since then, I had built Apex Estate Management from the ground up, catering exclusively to the top 0.1%. I kept my success entirely hidden from my family, knowing they would either sabotage it or demand a cut. They still believed I was scrubbing floors for minimum wage, a lie I allowed them to believe because it kept them out of my life. But Chloe's engagement to Julian Kensington required a family reunion. Julian was 36, the heir to an old money real estate dynasty, and he carried himself with the unbearable arrogance of a man who had never earned a single dollar he spent. The dinner was held at the most exclusive country club in the city. The room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and pretentious floral arrangements. We were seated at a long mahogany table, the Kensington family on one side and my family on the other. Julian's mother, Eleanor Kensington, sat at the center. She was a legendary real estate mogul, sharp, intimidating, and completely silent, as my mother commanded the room's attention. Helen stood up, tapping her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. She offered a sickeningly sweet toast to the union of two elite families, praising Chloe's non-existent brilliance and Julian's pedigree. Then her eyes landed on me, sitting quietly at the end of the table. A cruel, familiar smirk played on her lips. She gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "And this is our other daughter, Maya," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She just cleans houses for a living." The Kensington relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father Thomas chuckled and shook his head. "We have given up on her, but she means well." I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, waiting for the inevitable pitying looks from Julian's family. But the pity never came. Instead, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted in an instant. Across the table, Eleanor Kensington froze. Her wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. The color drained completely from her face as she stared at me. The polite chatter around the table died instantly. Eleanor slowly lowered her glass, her eyes wide with shock. "Wait," she whispered, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You are Maya." The table went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in that massive dining room. Eleanor stood up, pushing her chair back. To the absolute astonishment of everyone present, this notoriously ruthless billionaire extended her hand toward me with deep respect. "You are Maya, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex," she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You are the one who completely restructured our family's commercial real estate portfolio last quarter and saved us millions." My mother lost all color. Her jaw went slack, and she looked back and forth between Eleanor and me as if we were speaking a foreign language. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Chloe's perfect smile vanished, replaced by an ugly mask of confusion and rage. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Eleanor, you must be confused," Chloe stammered, her voice shrill with panic. "Maya is not a chief executive. She is a maid. She scrubs toilets." Julian slammed his hand on the table, glaring at me with absolute contempt. He could not stand the idea that my family was anything less than what they presented. "Do not play games with my mother," Julian sneered. "My mother does not do business with maids. Stop trying to embarrass your sister." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I calmly reached into my designer bag, pulled out my phone, and opened my primary business account. I looked directly into Julian's angry eyes. "Then why is your mother's signature on a $12 million contract with my maid service?" I asked. I turned the screen toward him, displaying the contract bearing the official Kensington family crest. The horror on Julian's face was a masterpiece. He stared at the document, unable to comprehend how the woman his fiancée relentlessly mocked held the keys to his entire financial future. My mother sank back into her seat as if her legs could not support her weight. For 33 years, she treated me like dirt beneath her shoes. Now she realized that I was the only person who could save them from the ruin they had brought upon themselves. The balance of real power had finally shifted forever. Won academic scholarships, hoping my achievements would finally earn my parents' respect. Instead, my father Thomas and my mother Helen only cared about my older sister Chloe. Chloe was their golden child, a public relations executive whose only real talent was manipulating them into funding her lavish lifestyle. When I was 19, they completely drained my college fund to bail out Chloe's failed boutique. I had to drop out of school and scrub floors at a local diner just to pay my rent. But I never gave up. I taught myself to code during my graveyard shifts, eventually building Apex Estate Management, a software empire that managed property portfolios for the top 1%. I kept my massive wealth entirely hidden from my family. To them, I was still the pathetic failure who cleaned houses for a living. I let them believe that lie because it kept their toxic greed away from my bank accounts. The ultimate showdown happened last Saturday at Chloe's engagement dinner. She was marrying Julian Kensington, a man born into generational wealth who carried himself with unbearable arrogance. The dinner was held at an upscale country club. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and expensive floral arrangements. Our families sat across from each other at a long mahogany table. Julian's mother, Eleanor Kensington, sat at the center. She was a legendary real estate mogul, sharp, intimidating, and completely silent as my mother commanded the room. Helen stood up, tapping her champagne flute with a silver spoon. She offered a sickeningly sweet toast to the union of two elite families, praising Chloe's brilliance and Julian's pedigree. Then her eyes landed on me, sitting quietly at the end of the table. A cruel, familiar smirk played on her lips. She gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "And this is our other daughter, Maya," she announced, her voice ringing loud enough for everyone to hear. "She just cleans houses for a living." My father Thomas chuckled, shaking his head as he sliced his steak. "We have given up on her, but she means well." The Kensington relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging pitying glances. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, waiting for the inevitable humiliation to pass. But the humiliation never came. Instead, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted in an instant. Across the table, Eleanor Kensington froze. Her wineglass stopped halfway to her lips. The color drained completely from her face as she stared directly at me. The polite chatter around the table died immediately. Eleanor slowly lowered her glass, her eyes wide with shock. "Wait," she whispered, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You are Maya." The table went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in that massive dining room. Eleanor stood up, pushing her chair back. To the absolute astonishment of everyone present, this notoriously ruthless billionaire extended her hand toward me with deep respect. "You are Maya, the chief executive officer of Apex," she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You are the one who completely restructured our family's commercial real estate portfolio last quarter and saved us millions." My mother lost all color. Her jaw went slack and she looked back and forth between Eleanor and me, as if we were speaking a foreign language. Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Chloe's perfect smile vanished, replaced by an ugly mask of confusion and rage. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Eleanor, you must be confused," Chloe stammered, her voice shrill with panic. "Maya is not a chief executive, she is a maid, she scrubs toilets." Julian slammed his hand on the table, glaring at me with absolute contempt. He could not stand the idea that my family was anything less than what they presented. "Do not play games with my mother," Julian sneered. "My mother does not do business with maids. Stop trying to embarrass your sister." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I calmly reached into my designer bag, pulled out my phone, and opened my primary business account. I looked directly into Julian's angry eyes. "Then why is your mother's signature on a $12 million contract with my maid service?" I asked. I turned the screen toward him, displaying the contract bearing the official Kensington family crest. The horror on Julian's face was a masterpiece. He stared at the document, unable to comprehend how the woman his fiancée relentlessly mocked held the keys to his entire financial future. My mother sank back into her seat as if her legs could not support her weight. For 35 years, she treated me like dirt beneath her shoes. Now she realized that I was the only person who could save them from the ruin they had brought upon themselves. The balance of real power had finally shifted forever. I stood up, smoothing my dress and offering Eleanor a polite nod. "It has been a pleasure doing business with you, Eleanor," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "But I think I have overstayed my welcome at this particular table." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving my toxic family suffocating in the silent judgment of their wealthy guests. The cool evening air of the country club parking lot offered a much-needed relief. Gravel crunched beneath my heels as I walked toward the valet stand, eager to leave the disaster completely behind. I did not make it past the first row of luxury cars before a heavy hand tightly gripped my arm. It was my father, Thomas, his face flushed with a mixture of deep embarrassment and explosive rage. My mother, Helen, stood right behind him, her hands visibly trembling. Chloe trailed them closely. "We need to talk now." I pulled my arm out of his grip. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear." Chloe stepped forward, threatening to ban me from her wedding. I laughed and walked away, climbing into my custom SUV. The driver pulled away, leaving them staring in shock. My iPad illuminated the SUV. An urgent notification from my legal department detailed an attack. Julian was trying to destroy my livelihood. 3 minor vendors had submitted notices of immediate contract termination. These companies provided high-end linens. It was a calculated strike designed to disrupt my daily operations and force me into a desperate scramble for replacements. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The text read, "Old money talks. Stick to your mop and bucket." I let the microaggression wash over me. Julian thought he was putting me back in my place. He thought his wealth gave him the power to erase everything I had built. He expected me to panic and beg my parents to intervene. I did not panic. I leaned back and let out a genuine laugh. We pulled up to the Apex headquarters. I stepped out and walked into the grand lobby. My executive team was already waiting in the main conference room. My general counsel, Marcus, stood at the head of the long glass table with a stack of printed contracts. He looked tense, adjusting his glasses as I took my seat. "Maya, we have a situation." Marcus began sliding the termination notices toward me. 3 vendors pulled out within the last hour. We traced the pressure back to Julian Kensington. He used his mother's commercial accounts to force them into dropping us. He threatened to totally blackball them. "We must secure alternative vendors by tomorrow morning or risk defaulting on our service agreements." I tossed the termination notices back onto the table. "I do not want alternative vendors, Marcus. Draft a formal acknowledgement of their termination and send it immediately." Marcus frowned, clearly confused. "These suppliers handle the seasonal turnover. We must replace them immediately." I stood up and walked over to the tall windows. Do you remember the Sterling Holding Corporation portfolio we acquired last year? I asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Yes, the bankrupt conglomerate. We bought their distressed assets for pennies on the dollar and have been trying to liquidate the unprofitable subsidiaries ever since. Exactly, I replied, turning back to face him. Those three vendors Julian just pressured are the exact subsidiaries we have been trying to offload. They are drowning in toxic debt and pending litigation from environmental violations. I have been paying lawyers for 6 months trying to figure out how to legally sever them from Apex without tanking our quarterly earnings. The realization began to dawn on Marcus, his eyes widening as he looked down at the documents. I smiled, leaning against the glass table. Julian is arrogant, but he is not thorough, I explained. He did not bother to check the corporate structure before he threw his weight around. By actively interfering with those specific contracts and using financial coercion to force their termination, he committed tortious interference. But more importantly, because of the specific indemnity clauses built into those subsidiary contracts, any external party that deliberately forces a breach of service assumes the liability of the broken contracts. Marcus quickly flipped through the files, his finger tracing the legal jargon. He started to laugh, a low rumbling sound of pure disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me," Marcus said, looking up at me. By forcing them to drop Apex, Julian just legally assumed responsibility for their operational failures. He triggered the poison pill. I nodded, my smile widening into a predatory grin. Julian thought he was cutting off my supply chain, but all he did was cut the anchor from my neck and tie it around his own. He just legally assumed $2.5 million of toxic debt, and he does not even know it yet. Draft the transfer of liability papers and have them couriered to his private residence by tomorrow morning. I want him to wake up to the reality of his own arrogance. Just as Marcus gathered the files to leave, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. David, my lead private investigator, walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He bypassed Marcus and handed the folder directly to me. "You asked me to dig into Julian Kensington's personal finances after the engagement announcement," David said, taking a seat. "I thought it was just a routine background check, but the guy is a walking red flag." I opened the folder, spreading the financial statements and bank records across the glass table. "What am I looking at, David?" I asked, scanning the highlighted columns of offshore accounts and wire transfers. "You are looking at a mirage," David replied, leaning forward. "Everyone thinks Julian is a billionaire because of his mother's real estate empire. But Eleanor Kensington cut off his personal trust fund 3 years ago because of a massive gambling problem. Julian is completely broke." I stared at the documents, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the lie my sister was marrying into. "He has 0 liquid assets," David continued. "To maintain his wealthy lifestyle and pay for this extravagant wedding, he has been siphoning money from a shell corporation." I looked up, meeting David's gaze. "Whose shell corporation?" I asked. David let out a heavy sigh. "It is not just any corporation, Maya. Julian has been embezzling millions directly from his own mother's charitable foundation." I closed the folder, running my hand over the smooth paper. A cold thrill of anticipation rushed through my veins. Julian Kensington had tried to put me in my place with a racist text message and a stolen supply chain. He thought he was untouchable. I looked back down at the folder and smiled. Julian is not a billionaire. He is completely broke, and he is embezzling from his mother's charity. The very next morning, my phone vibrated with a meticulously worded text message from my mother, Helen. She invited me to a grand Sunday cookout at their suburban home, claiming she wanted to apologize. I knew my mother better than anyone. Helen did not do apologies. She did ambushes. But I accepted the invitation anyway, slipping the thick financial dossier into my leather tote bag. I drove my custom SUV through the familiar wrought iron gates of my childhood home. The expansive backyard was overflowing with the entire congregation from our church. Heavy smoke from the barbecue grill hung in the humid air, mixing with the chatter of relatives. I spotted Pastor William standing near the patio, wearing a deeply judgmental expression. This was not a family gathering. This was a public tribunal designed to force my submission. I had barely stepped onto the manicured lawn before Helen intercepted me. She linked her arm through mine with an iron grip and dragged me toward Chloe and Thomas. A tight circle of gossiping aunties immediately formed around us, cutting off any easy exit. Pastor Williams stepped forward holding his worn leather Bible. Helen plastered on a look of profound sorrow, addressing the growing crowd. "We have gathered everyone here today to pray for Maya," she announced, her voice shaking with fake tears. "Her sudden wealth has poisoned her spirit. She has turned her back on her own blood, and we are asking the Lord to soften her selfish heart." The aunties muttered their disapproval. Chloe stood beside our mother wearing a modest sundress and wiping away imaginary tears. Pastor Williams placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Maya wealth is a test of character," he intoned deeply. "Your family has supported you through your darkest times. It is only righteous that you share your blessings to secure your sister's future." Thomas stepped forward holding a sleek leather folder. He shoved a dense contract and a gold pen toward my chest. "You are going to sign over 20% of your company to Chloe as a wedding gift," Thomas demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Our people need to build and share generational wealth. You owe this to your sister after the embarrassment you caused her." I looked at the contract and then at my father's demanding eyes. The sheer audacity of their greed was almost suffocating, but I did not lose my composure. I slowly pushed the gold pen away and let out a sharp, unapologetic laugh that startled the entire circle. "Generational wealth," I asked, projecting my voice across the patio to ensure every church member heard me. "You want to talk to me about generational wealth, Thomas? Let us talk about Big Mama's house." The murmurs in the crowd instantly died down. The aunties leaned in closer, their eyes wide. Helen stiffened, her fake tears vanishing instantly. "Do not bring your grandmother into this," Helen hissed, stepping toward me. But I refused to be silenced. I looked directly at Pastor Williams. "Did they tell you, Pastor?" I asked, gesturing toward my parents. "Did they tell you how they secretly took out a massive second mortgage on Big Mama's fully paid off historic home? They drained the equity just to pay for Chloe's diamond engagement ring, because Julian claimed his funds were tied up in offshore investments." A collective gasp ripped through the yard. Several aunties clutched their pearls. Big Mama's house was a sacred cornerstone of our family history, and the idea that it had been leveraged to buy jewelry for a wealthy white man sent shockwaves through the congregation. Chloe turned a violent shade of red. "That is a lie," Chloe screamed, stepping toward me. "Julian is a billionaire. He does not need our money. You are just a jealous, bitter liar." I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper from the dossier. I held up the bank transfer record showing exactly where the funds from the second mortgage had gone. "Here is the wire transfer," I announced loudly. $500,000 wired directly from Thomas Adams to the jeweler's account. You sold our family legacy so your golden child could play pretend with a broke fraud." The crowd erupted into chaotic whispers. Pastor Williams took a stunned step backward, looking at my parents with profound disappointment. Helen was hyperventilating, grabbing Thomas by the arm, as their carefully constructed social image began to crack in real time. But my father was not finished. The public exposure of his financial sins pushed him over the edge into pure desperation. His face twisted into a mask of absolute fury. He threw the wedding contract onto the ground and pulled a different document from his leather folder. "You think you hold all the cards because you have some money now," Thomas snarled, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He shoved the crumpled medical document directly into my face. "You are going to sign your company over to us today, or I will send this file to your corporate board and every single one of your wealthy clients." He tapped the paper aggressively. "They would love to know all about the involuntary psychiatric hold you were placed under when you were 20 years old. They will see that the brilliant chief executive officer of Apex is nothing but a documented unstable liability." He was referring to the darkest period of my life. At 20, I tried to expose their financial abuse. They used their connections to forcibly commit me, claiming I was a danger to myself just to discredit my voice and hide their abuse. They held that trauma over my head for 13 years, using it as a loaded gun. The aunties gasped, looking at me with fearful hesitation. My father smiled a vicious grin, believing he had played the ultimate trump card. He thought the shame of my past would force me to surrender my empire. I stared at the medical document in my father's trembling hand. Once that paper represented my most terrifying moment. Today, it meant absolutely nothing. I did not shrink back or lower my eyes. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my phone. My father smirked, thinking I was about to call my lawyers to draft the transfer of my company. He puffed his chest, looking at the gossiping aunties and Pastor Williams. He wanted them to witness my complete surrender. Instead, I opened the settings on my phone. Thomas had rented a massive premium sound system for the cookout to ensure every single church member could hear his boastful speeches. I bypassed the poorly secured network, pairing my device to the main speakers. A loud electronic chime echoed across the entire backyard, signaling the connection. "What are you doing?" Helen snapped, stepping forward with a scowl. I did not answer her. I pressed play on an audio file I had extracted from Julian Kensington's compromised cloud storage during my corporate investigation. The backyard was dead silent as a sharp burst of static hissed through the towering speakers. Then Julian's unmistakable, arrogant voice boomed over the patio. It echoed off the brick walls and carried over the lawn. The recording was a voicemail he had left for Chloe just 3 days after their engagement party. "I do not care how you get the rest of the money," Chloe Julian's recorded. Voice sneered, dripping with absolute contempt. "Just bleed your stupid parents dry for the wedding costs. Tell them it is an investment in their social standing. Who cares if they have to leverage that decrepit old house again? Once we are married, we are cutting those ghetto embarrassments off anyway. I cannot have my business associates associating with your loud, tacky relatives. Just get the cash and keep them away from my mother." The audio clip ended with a sharp click. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody in the backyard moved. The humid air suddenly felt freezing cold. The silence was so absolute I could hear the barbecue grill sizzling. Then the backyard erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. The judgment that had been directed at me just moments before instantly violently pivoted toward my parents and my sister. Auntie Sarah dropped her plastic cup of sweet tea onto the patio stones. Pastor Williams' face twisted in deep disgust as he stared at Thomas. "Ghetto embarrassments." Pastor Williams repeated, his deep voice booming with righteous anger. "Is that the generational wealth you were trying to build, Thomas? You mortgaged your family legacy to hand it over to a man who mocks your very existence behind your back." Thomas turned a violent shade of purple. His smug, victorious grin completely melted away, replaced by profound, sickening humiliation. He looked down at the medical document in his hand, the weapon he thought would break me, and let it fall uselessly to the grass. Helen let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. The social image she had spent decades meticulously crafting was disintegrating right in front of the entire congregation. The whispers of the church members grew into loud, angry murmurs. They were realizing that the golden child's fairy tale wedding was nothing but a transactional scam built on lies and disrespect. Chloe could not handle the exposure. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy fiancé had been violently shattered in front of the very people she constantly bragged to. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and lunged directly at me. Her hands were curled into claws, aiming straight for my face. I did not panic. I simply took one calm, deliberate step to the left. Chloe was moving too fast to stop her momentum. Her designer heels caught the edge of the patio stone. She tripped wildly, her arms flailing in the air as she pitched forward past me. She crashed headfirst into the long buffet table heavily laden with food. The folding table collapsed under her weight. Chloe plunged face down into a massive aluminum tray of mustard potato salad. A bowl of baked beans shattered beside her, sending sticky red sauce splashing across her expensive floral sundress. She thrashed around in the ruined food, screaming in utter humiliation as mayonnaise and mustard smeared across her hair and face. Several aunties shrieked, stepping back to avoid the flying debris, but nobody rushed forward to help her up. The golden child was literally rolling in her own mess. Helen rushed forward, sobbing hysterically as she tried to pull Chloe out of the ruined food. Thomas stood frozen, staring blankly at the disaster unfolding on his perfectly manicured lawn. He had invited all these people here to witness my destruction, and instead, he had orchestrated his own. I walked slowly toward the barbecue grill, where Thomas had originally demanded my signature. I reached into my leather tote bag one final time. I pulled out a thick legal folder bound with a red seal. I looked down at my parents, who were now frantically trying to wipe mustard off Chloe's ruined dress. The church members watched in stunned silence, waiting to see what I would do next. I did not just come here today to play that voicemail. I said, my voice steady and cold, carrying effortlessly over the quiet yard. I came to hand you this. I tossed the heavy legal folder onto the side table next to the grill. It landed with a loud, definitive smack. Thomas finally looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of panic. "What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "That is a formal notice of foreclosure," I replied, meeting his terrified gaze with absolute indifference. "I bought the debt from the bank yesterday morning. Because you fraudulently acquired that second mortgage, the terms have been accelerated. The bank is taking Big Mama's house on Monday." Monday morning arrived with a frantic disruption in the lobby of Apex Estate Management. I was reviewing our financial projections in my penthouse office when my intercom buzzed. My assistant quickly informed me that my parents and sister were downstairs, screaming at the receptionists. They had bypassed the security gate and were demanding immediate access to the chief executive officer. I watched the live security feed. Thomas was pacing furiously near the elevators, while Helen frantically waved her handbag at the bewildered guards. Chloe stood silently behind them, hiding behind dark sunglasses. The commercial bank had executed the foreclosure right on schedule. The locks on Big Mama's house had been changed at exactly 8 o'clock. They were now homeless, and their carefully constructed facade of generational wealth had finally crumbled onto the front porch. I instructed my head of security to quietly escort them up to the secondary conference room. I did not want their desperate theatrics disrupting my hard-working staff. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Thomas was tapping his knuckles against the mahogany table. Helen looked as though she had aged a decade overnight. Her perfect posture had collapsed and her makeup was smeared from crying. Chloe was weeping openly. "You have to fix this right now," Thomas demanded the second I closed the door. He did not offer an apology for the ambush at the cookout. His tone carried the same arrogant entitlement he had used to belittle me. "The bank changed the locks. We could not even grab my golf clubs." Helen slammed her hands flat onto the table. "Do you have any idea what this looks like, Maya?" she shrieked. "Julian is threatening to call off the engagement after that audio leaked. If his family finds out the bride's parents are homeless, the wedding is dead. We will be a laughingstock. You have millions sitting in your corporate accounts. You are going to wire whatever amount is necessary to buy that house back immediately. You owe this family your protection." Chloe nodded vigorously, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks. "You cannot do this to me," she whined. "The Kensingtons expect absolute stability. If we lose the house, I lose everything. You have to write the check today." I walked to the head of the conference table and took my seat. I did not raise my voice or show panic. I simply steepled my fingers and looked calmly at the three people who had spent my life trying to tear me down. They had stolen my college fund, mocked my career choices, and tried to force me into a psychiatric hold to cover up their financial abuse. Now they sat in my corporate headquarters, demanding I empty my bank accounts to save them from the consequences of their own actions. I let the uncomfortable silence stretch out, allowing their desperation to peak. Then, I reached into my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a manila folder, placing it in the center of the mahogany table. "I already took care of the bank," I said, my voice calm and steady. Thomas let out an exhale of relief, his shoulders dropping. Helen closed her eyes and raised her trembling hands toward the ceiling. I slid the thick stack of papers out of the folder. On top was the official property deed bearing the signature of the commercial bank executive I had dealt with over the weekend. I bought the house back yesterday afternoon, I explained, tapping the parchment paper. The foreclosure has been entirely settled. The property is completely free and clear of all previous encumbrances. Helen lunged across the wide conference table. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she reached to grab the deed. "Oh, thank goodness," she gasped, her manicured fingers trembling as they hovered directly over the document. "I knew you would not let your family sink into poverty. I knew you would do the right thing for your sister." Just as her fingernails brushed the parchment, I swiftly pulled the deed backward out of her reach. Helen's hands slapped against the empty mahogany surface. She looked up at me, her expression twisting into pure confusion. "I did not buy it for you," I stated, my tone dropping to absolute ice. "I bought it for my corporate portfolio. It is now a rental property managed exclusively by Apex Estate Management." Thomas shot up from his chair, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "What are you talking about?" he barked, pointing a finger at me. "That is our home. It has been in this family for generations. You cannot just steal it from us." "I am not stealing anything, Thomas," I replied casually, flipping to the second document in the folder. "I purchased a distressed asset at fair market value. You are the ones who leveraged it away for a diamond ring." I pushed the second document across the table directly in front of his angry face. "This is your new lease agreement," I announced loudly. "I am willing to let you stay as long as you follow the rules. Rent is $4,000 a month and it is due on the 1st without exception. If you miss a payment, my management team will begin formal eviction proceedings immediately." Thomas stared at the lease agreement as if it were a venomous snake. Chloe stopped crying, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. Helen sank slowly back into her leather chair, the blood draining completely from her pale face. They were trapped. They had nowhere else to go and no money to fall back on. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket, and gave them one final look. "You have until 5 o'clock today to sign the lease, or my security team will toss your belongings onto the curb," I said, turning toward the exit. I paused with my hand on the glass handle, glancing back at Helen. "You missed a spot on the floor, by the way." The satisfaction of watching my toxic family squirm in my boardroom was short-lived. I had barely returned to my penthouse office when my private encrypted line chimed. Only 3 people in the world had that number, and Eleanor Kensington was not one of them. Yet her sharp, aristocratic voice filled the receiver the moment I answered. She did not offer pleasantries or small talk. She simply dictated a time and an address, demanding my presence at an exclusive Manhattan social club that evening. She emphasized absolute secrecy, instructing me to arrive through the service elevator in the underground parking garage. I canceled my afternoon meetings and instructed my lead investigator, David, to remain on standby. The social club was a fortress of old money and quiet power hidden behind an unmarked door on the Upper East Side. I bypassed the main lobby and took the freight elevator directly to the private dining suites on the top floor. The heavy mahogany doors opened to reveal Eleanor sitting alone at a long oak table. She was nursing a glass of scotch, looking remarkably less intimidating than she had at the engagement dinner. The polished armor of the Kensington matriarch had cracked, revealing a deeply tired woman holding a thick leather-bound dossier. "Sit down, Maya," she ordered, sliding a heavy crystal glass across the table toward me. "We have a mutual problem that requires your unique set of skills." I took the seat opposite her, ignoring the drink. "Your son is the problem, Eleanor," I stated plainly. "Julian attempted to destroy my supply chain yesterday. I handled it, but I have no interest in cleaning up his messes." Eleanor took a slow sip of her scotch. "I am not asking you to clean up his mess. I am asking you to help me expose it." She leaned forward, her piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "I despise your sister. Chloe is a vapid social climber who brings absolutely nothing of value to our family. But she is the perfect unwitting accomplice for Julian's current operation." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite myself. "What operation?" Eleanor tapped her manicured fingernails against the leather dossier. As you so astutely pointed out at that disastrous dinner, Julian is entirely broke. I cut off his trust fund 3 years ago, hoping the shock would force him to abandon his gambling addiction. Instead, he merely shifted his vices. He has been leveraging the Kensington name to solicit private investments from elite circles. He promises massive returns on exclusive commercial real estate developments that do not actually exist. A Ponzi scheme, I concluded, piecing the puzzle together. He is using new investors to pay off his old gambling debts. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed, her voice tight with suppressed rage. And this lavish wedding is nothing but a grandiose front. He is using the guise of engagement parties and wedding celebrations to gather high net worth individuals in one room. He pitches his fake fund over champagne and caviar. He is collecting millions in cash gifts and investments from our oldest family friends. If this goes public, the Kensington reputation will be irreparably destroyed. Why come to me? I asked, folding my arms across the table. You have an army of corporate lawyers and financial advisors at your disposal. Because Julian is monitoring our internal family accounts, Eleanor explained. If my people start digging, he will instantly know I am on to him. He will panic and drain the remaining accounts before fleeing the country. I need an external entity. I need the forensic accounting team at Apex Estate Management to quietly trace the money he embezzled from my charitable foundation. You already have his banking details. You just need to follow the digital paper trail and document every fraudulent transaction without triggering his alarms. That is a significant expenditure of my corporate resources, I replied, keeping my tone strictly professional. What is in it for Apex? Eleanor smiled, a cold, calculating expression that matched my own. In exchange for your discretion and your forensic team's findings, I will hand over the Kensington family's most lucrative commercial contracts exclusively to your firm. You will manage our entire global portfolio. It will double the valuation of Apex overnight. It was a masterful proposition, a mutually beneficial alliance forged in the fires of our shared contempt for Julian and Chloe. I reached across the table and firmly shook Eleanor's hand, sealing the agreement. My team will start tonight, I promised. We will build an airtight case that Julian cannot escape. Before you go, there is one more thing you need to see, Eleanor said, opening the leather dossier. She slid a single crisp sheet of paper toward me. It was a printed copy of the master wedding guest list. It detailed the attendees, their table assignments, and the expected value of their wedding gifts. I scanned the names quickly. My eyes locked onto a highlighted row near the bottom of the page. Beside the names Thomas and Helen Adams was a specific handwritten notation. It was penned in Julian's unmistakable scrawl. The note read, "Guaranteed investment commitment of $100,000 for the wedding fund." I stared at the number, my blood running completely cold. $100,000. My parents were completely broke. I knew exactly what was in their bank accounts. They had just lost their house to foreclosure. They did not have $10,000, let alone $100,000. There was only one place Thomas could access that kind of liquid cash on short notice without triggering an immediate credit check. My mind flashed back to the Sunday cookout, the grand speeches about generational wealth, Pastor Williams standing on the patio holding his worn leather Bible. The sudden realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. They did not just leverage Big Mama's house. Thomas was the primary treasurer for the church. He had full unchecked access to the congregational accounts. I looked up at Eleanor, my jaw clenched tight. I did not just come here to play investigator. I whispered, my voice trembling with a terrifying new rage. My parents did not have this money. They stole it from the church building fund to impress your son. The revelation of my parents' ultimate crime hung in the air of the private dining suite. Stealing from the church building fund was a felony, a betrayal of the very community that had trusted them for decades. I left the social club with a flash drive of Eleanor's financial records and a burning directive to execute the next phase of our alliance. Eleanor had generously financed Chloe's bridal shower under the guise of welcoming her into the Kensington family. In reality, it was the perfect trap. The shower was scheduled for the following afternoon at Rosewood Manor, a sprawling luxury country estate in upstate New York known for hosting elite celebrity gatherings. It was the exact kind of venue Chloe required to project her fabricated status to her new social circle. I arrived at the estate just as the valet service began parking a line of sleek foreign sports cars. The sweeping manicured lawns were dotted with white linen tents and towering floral arrangements of imported orchids. A string quartet played softly near a massive ice sculpture carved into the shape of a swan. Chloe had invited 50 women, mostly Julian's wealthy female relatives, and the snobby, high society bridesmaids she had recently acquired to replace her actual friends. I walked past the security checkpoint without a glance, my heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone path leading to the main terrace. Chloe was holding court near a tiered champagne tower wearing a custom silk gown and a tiara that bordered on absurd. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by Julian's cousin when her eyes locked onto me. The fake smile immediately melted off her face. Her perfectly contoured features twisted into a mask of absolute fury. She slammed her crystal flute onto a passing waiter's tray and marched directly toward me, her gaggle of bridesmaids trailing closely behind her like obedient lapdogs. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing the attention of the Kensington matriarchs across the lawn. "You were explicitly uninvited from every single wedding event. Security is supposed to keep trash off the property." I did not blink. I reached into my designer handbag and produced a sealed envelope embossed with the Kensington family crest. "I am here as the official financial representative for Eleanor Kensington," I stated loudly enough for the bridesmaids to hear. Since Eleanor graciously funded this entire spectacle, she requested that Apex Estate Management oversee the vendor contracts and ensure her money was being spent appropriately. "I am strictly here in a professional capacity to audit the event." The bridesmaids exchanged confused glances, whispering behind their manicured hands. Chloe turned a vibrant shade of scarlet. The humiliation of her future mother-in-law, sending an auditor to her bridal shower, was eating her alive. She needed to reassert her dominance immediately before her new friends realized she held absolutely no power in the Kensington family dynamic. Chloe snatched a fresh mimosa from a nearby tray. She took a deliberate sip, maintaining hostile eye contact with me. "You are just a glorified accountant, Maya," she sneered loudly, stepping dangerously close to my personal space. "You have always been jealous of me. You have always wanted my life. And now you are desperately crashing my party just to get a glimpse of high society." With a swift, calculated flick of her wrist, Chloe tipped her glass forward. The sticky orange liquid in champagne splashed directly onto my tailored trousers and pooled onto the pristine marble terrace. A collective gasp echoed from the bridesmaids. Chloe tossed the empty crystal flute onto the ground, where it shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. "Oops!" Chloe mocked, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "It looks like there is a mess on the floor. Why do not you do what you do best and mop it up? Maybe if you do a good job, I will let you take some leftover cake back to your miserable little apartment." The bridesmaids erupted into cruel giggles. They looked at me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to break down or flee in embarrassment. I looked down at the spilled champagne and then back up at my sister. I did not yell. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers twice. Instantly, the heavy oak doors of the main manor swung open. Richard, the head estate manager, stepped out onto the terrace, flanked by 4 burly security guards in dark suits. He walked directly past Chloe and stood at attention beside me, giving a formal bow. "Is there a problem, Miss Adams?" Richard asked, his voice carrying effortlessly over the string quartet. Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Yes, there is a problem, Richard. This woman is harassing me and my guests. I want her escorted off the property immediately." Richard did not even look at Chloe. He kept his eyes respectfully fixed on me. "Shall I have the groundskeepers clean the spill, ma'am?" he inquired politely. Chloe's smug expression faltered. She looked from Richard to me, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Why are you asking her?" she demanded, her voice pitching higher. "I am the client. I rented this venue." "Actually, Miss Adams," Richard said, finally turning to face my sister with a look of polite disdain, You did not rent this venue. Eleanor Kensington transferred the funds directly to our corporate holding company. Furthermore, I do not take orders from you. I take orders from the property owner. Richard gestured respectfully toward me. Apex Estate Management purchased Rosewood Manor 3 months ago. Maya is my employer. The absolute silence that fell over the terrace was deafening. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The snobby bridesmaids stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, suddenly realizing they had just mocked a woman who owned a $20 million country estate. Chloe physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven cobblestones. Her jaw dropped open, struggling to form words that refused to come. The illusion she had spent months building was disintegrating in real time. I stepped forward, stepping directly over the shattered glass of her champagne flute. Since we are discussing Eleanor Kensington's generous funding, I have an important update regarding the event logistics. I announced, my voice echoing cleanly across the quiet lawn. Eleanor paid for the venue rental. However, it appears you were responsible for the catering contract. I pulled a secondary document from my handbag and held it up. The estate manager just informed me that your personal credit card for the catering deposit was declined this morning. The bank flagged it for insufficient funds. Chloe let out a strangled gasp. The remaining color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and sickly. The bridesmaids immediately began backing away from her, distancing themselves from the financial contagion. Since Apex Estate Management does not operate a charity, we will not be serving the 5-course meal you promised your guests, I stated flatly, turning to face the horrified bridal party. The catering staff is packing up the kitchen as we speak. If you want to eat today, you better start scrubbing the marble. I turned back to Richard, offering a brief nod. The event is officially cancelled due to breach of contract. Please have your security team clear all unpaid guests off my property immediately. The heavy oak door of Pastor Williams' office felt solid under my knuckles. I pushed it open to find the clergyman sitting behind a desk cluttered with blueprints. He looked up with a welcoming smile that faded when he saw the cold determination in my eyes. I walked straight to his desk and dropped a thick black binder on top of the cheerful plans. I did not offer warm greetings. I simply told him to open it. He adjusted his glasses and flipped open the binder. Inside were bank records, wire transfers, and forensic accounting summaries generated by my investigators at Apex Estate Management. It took him 2 minutes to realize what he was looking at. The color drained from his face. His hands shook as he traced the numbers connecting the church's building fund to an unregulated account. $100,000 was missing. I stood silently watching decades of trust shatter in his eyes. Call them, I instructed, my voice betraying no emotion. Tell them it is an absolute emergency regarding the expansion. Do not mention that I am here. 30 minutes later, Thomas and Helen breezed into the administrative wing. They were vibrating with self-importance, expecting to be consulted on the new designs. Their confident strides abruptly halted the moment they crossed the threshold and saw me sitting calmly in the corner chair. Helen immediately bristled, her jaw clenching as she clutched her handbag. Thomas narrowed his eyes, shooting a look of pure disdain in my direction, before turning his artificial charm toward the pastor. "What is she doing here?" Thomas demanded, pointing a rigid finger at me. "This is a private meeting. She has no business being involved in congregational matters." Pastor Williams did not offer them a seat. He remained standing, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the wood. "I know about the missing funds, Thomas," he said, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of sorrow and rage. "I know about the $100,000 you wired out of the building account last week." The air in the office instantly vanished. Helen let out a choked gasp, stepping backward until her shoulders hit the doorframe. Thomas stiffened, his eyes darting frantically between the pastor and the black binder sitting on the desk. He adjusted his suit jacket, pasting on a condescending smile. He was cornered, but his arrogance refused to surrender. "You are overreacting," Pastor Thomas said, adopting a soothing, patronizing tone. "It is a temporary reallocation of capital. Julian Kensington is a financial prodigy. He offered the church an exclusive opportunity to buy into a highly restricted investment vehicle. That money will double in less than 6 months. I am securing the future of this church. Helen jumped in to support the delusion. Julian manages billions, she added, her voice trembling slightly. We were doing the congregation a massive favor. We bypassed the standard administrative red tape to ensure the church did not miss the investment window. You should be thanking us for our financial stewardship. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. I walked over to the office door and opened it. David, my lead forensic accountant, stepped into the room holding a silver tablet. He did not introduce himself. He simply walked to the center of the office and pulled up the tracking software we had spent 24 hours perfecting. There is no investment vehicle, I stated, shattering their carefully constructed fantasy. Julian Kensington does not manage billions. He does not even have a legitimate brokerage license. David tapped his tablet, casting the financial data onto the large smart monitor mounted on the wall. The screen illuminated with a complex web of international bank transfers. The initial $100,000 wire from the church account was clearly visible. David traced the digital line with his stylus, showing exactly where the money went. It did not go into a high-yield domestic mutual fund. It went into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Julian has been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme utilizing his family name to defraud private investors. David explained, his tone entirely clinical. The money you stole was not invested. It was immediately liquidated and wired to offshore betting syndicates to cover his staggering illegal gambling debts. Your $100,000 is gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at the monitor, his mouth opening and closing. He had mortgaged his family home and stolen from his community to buy the approval of a con artist. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Helen clutched her chest, sinking into a chair as she began to hyperventilate. The Kensington wedding, the social elevation, the generational wealth, it was all a devastating illusion. Pastor Williams walked around his desk, stopping inches from my father's face. The righteous fury radiating from the clergyman was palpable. You violated the sanctity of this church, and you stole from the very people you swore to serve, he said, his voice echoing with devastating finality. I am giving you exactly 48 hours to return every single penny to the building fund. If the money is not in our account by Wednesday morning, I am taking this binder to the police. I will personally testify against you in criminal court. Thomas physically crumbled. His broad shoulders slumped and his imposing stature seemed to shrink before my eyes. The pride that had defined his existence evaporated, leaving behind a broken man facing imminent incarceration. He turned away from the pastor and looked at me. His eyes were wide with terror. He knew his credit was destroyed. He knew the house was gone. I was the only person who possessed the liquidity to save him from prison. Maya, he whispered, his voice cracking as he reached a desperate, trembling hand out toward me. Please, you are my daughter. You have to write me a loan today. I stared silently at the trembling hand my father extended toward me. This was the exact same hand that had ripped my college applications to shreds and slammed heavy doors in my face. Now it was curled tightly in a pathetic plea for salvation. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I looked past him to Helen, who was sobbing heavily into her palms. They had finally reached the absolute miserable bottom of their delusions. I turned slowly to my lead accountant, David, and gave him a brief nod. He immediately stepped out of the pastor's office, leaving me alone with the ruins of my family. I walked over to the heavy oak desk and opened the sleek leather briefcase I had brought with me. You want a loan, Thomas? I asked, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. I am not a bank. I do not issue loans to individuals with a documented history of severe financial fraud. However, I am willing to pay the $100,000 directly to the church building fund today. I will do this solely to keep the Adams name out of the local police blotter. Thomas let out a massive breath, sagging against the edge of the desk. Thank you, he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. You will get it back with interest. I swear it on my life. You are not paying me back, I stated flatly, pulling a thick legal document from my briefcase. I am purchasing my permanent freedom. I dropped the contract onto the desk right next to the damning financial records. It was 30 pages of airtight legal maneuvering drafted by my top corporate attorneys. This is an irrevocable severance agreement, I explained, tapping the pristine white paper. If I transfer this money to the church, you are going to sign this document right now. It contains a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You will never speak of my business, my personal life, or my finances to anyone ever again. More importantly, it contains a permanent relinquishment clause. You and Helen are signing away any and all future claims to my wealth, my estate, and my company. You will never ask me for a single cent for the rest of your natural lives. Thomas stared at the contract as if it were written in a foreign language. Helen slowly lowered her hands, staring at me with a mixture of horror and outrage. You are cutting your own parents off completely, she whispered. Over money. I am cutting you off over a lifetime of abuse, Helen, I corrected coldly. You stole from a church to impress a con artist. You traded my childhood home for a fleeting moment of high society validation. The money is just the final receipt. Sign the papers, or I walk out that door and Pastor Williams calls the authorities. The choice is entirely yours. For a long, excruciating minute, the office was dead silent. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a countdown. Thomas finally broke. He reached for the expensive fountain pen sitting in the brass holder on the pastor's desk. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip the metal barrel. He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the last page, sealing his complete financial surrender. He pushed the document toward Helen without meeting her eyes. She picked up the pen with immense reluctance. As Helen leaned over the desk to sign her name, she paused. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing with pure, unadulterated malice. She had lost everything, but she still desperately needed to inflict pain. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss. You think this money makes you powerful? She sneered. You are going to die completely alone, Maya. No amount of corporate wealth will ever change the fact that you are too hard and utterly unlovable. Nobody will ever truly want you. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. Her toxic words, which would have devastated me a decade ago, simply bounced off my armor. I reached down, grabbed my notary stamp from my briefcase, and pressed it firmly onto the signature line. The loud clack of the stamp echoed with absolute finality. The transaction was complete. Suddenly, the heavy oak door flew open, crashing violently against the wall. Chloe stormed into the office looking completely unhinged. Her designer hair was messy and her face was flushed dark red with rage. She had clearly been waiting outside and had overheard the final moments of our transaction. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. I know you are giving them $100,000, Chloe screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. If you are handing out cash to save this family, I want my cut. Julian needs liquidity to fix his investments, and you are sitting on millions. I calmly placed the signed contract into my briefcase and clicked the locks shut. You are not getting a dime from me, Chloe. Your fiancé is a fraud, and your wedding is a financial sinkhole. Chloe closed the distance between us, her chest heaving with fury. You listen to me, you arrogant witch, she threatened, stepping dangerously close. You are going to wire me $200,000 by tomorrow morning. If you do not, I am going straight to the press. I will tell the financial reporters that the brilliant CEO of Apex Estate Management is a ruthless psychopath who destroys her own family. I will ruin your corporate reputation and drag your stock prices straight into the dirt. Do not test me. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I stepped back and casually pointed toward the small black dome mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Are you trying to extort a corporate CEO on tape, Chloe? I asked, my tone dangerously light. Because my lawyers would love to add blackmail to Julian's impending federal indictment. Chloe's eyes darted upward to the small black dome mounted in the corner of the office. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her chalky and trembling. She snapped her mouth shut, turned on her heel, and bolted from the room without another word, the sound of her frantic footsteps echoing down the hallway. I calmly watched her retreat, knowing her desperation was only going to amplify the catastrophe waiting for her. The following evening was the rehearsal dinner held in the private glass conservatory of the Kensington Country Club. The room was a suffocating display of excess dripping with white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and the overwhelming arrogance of Julian's inner circle. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of vintage champagne and caviar canapes. I arrived not as a banished outcast, but explicitly as Eleanor Kensington's personal +1. Eleanor, having seen the indisputable proof of her son's impending ruin, had completely flipped her allegiance to self-preservation. She sat rigidly at the head table, sipping her martini and watching the impending train wreck with detached terror. Chloe was completely oblivious to the impending doom. She paraded around the room in a vintage silk gown, acting as though she had already been crowned royalty. She flashed her massive diamond ring at every passing guest, adopting a faux aristocratic accent that made my skin crawl. She clung to the arms of wealthy socialites she barely knew, laughing entirely too loud and demanding the attention of the room. Julian, however, was a completely different story. He stood near the mahogany bar, downing his third scotch in under an hour. He was sweating profusely, repeatedly checking his phone and shifting his weight with frantic, nervous energy. The walls were closing in on him, but his ego refused to let him surrender the illusion. He kept straightening his tie, forcing tight smiles whenever an investor approached him, playing the part of the untouchable billionaire. As the five-course dinner concluded, the clinking of silver against crystal signaled the beginning of the toasts. Julian stood up, adjusting his custom tuxedo jacket, and flashed his signature predatory smile. He grabbed a microphone, commanding the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist. He thanked his wealthy relatives for their attendance, praised Chloe's undeniable beauty, and then his eyes locked onto me. He could not resist the opportunity to reassert his dominance in front of his high society audience. "We also have a very special guest tonight," Julian announced, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured in my direction. "Chloe's older sister, Maya. It is truly generous of my mother to bring her along, considering she was not on the original guest list. Maya comes from a very different world than the rest of us here. Blue-collar origins, scraping by, working the kind of gritty, unglamorous jobs that build character. We should applaud her blue-collar work ethic." A ripple of cruel, polite laughter echoed through the room. Chloe beamed from her seat, clearly thrilled by the public humiliation. She raised her glass to him, mouthing her approval. "But that is the beauty of this country," Julian continued, pacing slightly, soaking up the attention. "Some of us are born to build empires, to move markets, and to shape the global economy. Others are born to manage the estates we live on. And speaking of empires, I am thrilled to officially announce my firm's newest acquisition tonight. We just locked in a massive luxury real estate development in Dubai. It is a monumental project. The seed funding cleared this morning, and construction begins next month. To the future." The guests erupted into enthusiastic applause, raising their champagne flutes to celebrate wealth that did not actually exist. Julian looked at me with a smug, victorious grin, believing he had just put the working-class sister firmly in her place. He took a long, arrogant sip of his scotch. I did not break eye contact. I calmly stood up from my seat beside Eleanor, picking up my own glass of sparkling water. The applause died down as the guests turned to look at me, expecting a flustered, embarrassed retreat. Instead, I walked directly to the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I stopped right in front of Julian, stepping into his personal space and forcing him to look down at me. "I would like to propose a toast as well," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent conservatory without the need for a microphone. "Congratulations on your Dubai project, Julian. It sounds incredibly ambitious. I am sure your investors were thrilled by your pitch." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, sealed legal envelope. I held it out to him. Julian stared at it, his confident smile faltering slightly. He hesitated, his eyes darting to his mother, who refused to look at him, before finally taking the envelope from my hand. "I thought you should know," I continued, making sure my voice carried all the way to the back of the room, reaching the ears of every elite guest present. "The Dubai developers officially pulled out of the deal this morning. They were highly disturbed when they discovered that your initial seed money was stolen directly from a Baptist church building fund. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. Guests froze with their drinks halfway to their mouths. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to cover her face. Julian's face drained of all color, turning an ashy, sickly gray. His smug arrogance vanished instantly. He ripped open the envelope, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out the federal injunction notices and the forensic accounting reports detailing his offshore wire transfers. The documents were irrefutable proof of his massive fraud. Before he could utter a single syllable of defense, the piercing ring of his cell phone cut through the dead silence. He pulled it from his pocket, staring at the caller ID with wide, terrified eyes. It was his bank. Federal authorities had just frozen every single one of his accounts. The device slipped from his trembling fingers, cracking against the polished marble floor with a sharp snap that broke the room's paralysis. Total chaos erupted inside the glass conservatory as wealthy investors lunged for their phones, shouting frantically into receivers, desperate to salvage their own capital from the wreckage of his lies. 3 hours later, the opulent bridal suite at the top of the hotel looked like the epicenter of a natural disaster. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, and the carefully curated illusion of Kensington wealth had imploded entirely. Discarded tissue paper, half-empty champagne bottles, and torn designer garment bags littered the plush carpets. Julian was tearing through the massive mahogany armoire, blindly shoving custom-tailored suits, cashmere sweaters, and expensive watches into a leather duffel bag. His silk bow tie hung loose around his neck, and his usually perfectly slicked hair stood up in erratic, sweat-soaked tufts. He was muttering hysterically under his breath, turning velvet cushions over and throwing drawers onto the floor, desperately searching for his passport and the keys to a private jet that federal agents had likely already impounded. Chloe trailed behind him, tripping over the heavy silk train of her rehearsal gown. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, making her look completely unhinged. She kept grabbing at his sleeves violently, trying to anchor him to the fantasy that was rapidly evaporating before her eyes. She refused to accept that the lavish wedding the high society magazine covers and her ascension to the elite class were officially dead. She shrieked at him to stop packing, insisting that his mother would simply wire him whatever pocket change he needed to make the federal agents disappear. She yelled that they had 500 guests arriving in less than 12 hours, and that he was ruining her perfect timeline. The heavy double doors of the suite clicked unlocked and swung open. I stepped into the room holding the master keycard I had acquired directly from the front desk concierge. Eleanor walked in right behind me. The Kensington matriarch looked absolutely lethal. She had swapped her elegant evening gown for a sharp black trench coat, projecting the cold, calculating aura of an executioner stepping up to the block. Julian spun around, dropping a stack of silk shirts onto the carpet when he saw his mother. He immediately launched into a pathetic, stammering defense. He begged her to call the family attorneys, pleading with her to authorize a bridge loan from the primary trust to get him out of the country before the marshals arrived to arrest him. Eleanor did not say a single word. She closed the distance between them in 3 precise, terrifying strides. She raised her right hand and struck him across the face with everything she had. The slap echoed like a gunshot through the sprawling suite. Julian stumbled backward, clutching his reddened cheek in absolute shock. Eleanor stood over him, her voice a deadly quiet hiss that commanded total obedience. She told him he was a disgusting parasite who had disgraced everything her ancestors had built over centuries. She informed him that she had just spent the last 3 hours on the phone with the board of directors and their elite legal team executing a total separation strategy. She was formally revoking his access to the Kensington name. His trust funds were permanently dissolved. His equity in the family holding company was seized to mitigate the investor damages, and he was officially dead to her. She turned her back on him, explicitly stating she would rather see him rot in a maximum security federal penitentiary than spend another single dime trying to protect a thief. Julian sank onto the edge of the unmade four-poster bed, burying his face in his hands, as the reality of his complete financial and familial destruction set in. He was weeping loudly, a broken shell of the arrogant man who had toasted to his own brilliance just hours ago. Chloe, however, possessed a level of delusion that bordered on clinical insanity. She watched Eleanor exit the suite, leaving just the three of us standing in the wreckage of her social climbing dreams. Instead of realizing she was engaged to a bankrupt criminal who was hours away from wearing handcuffs, she whipped her head around and locked her tear-filled, desperate eyes onto me. She rushed forward, grabbing my wrists with claw-like desperation. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin as she sobbed, her voice pitching into a hysterical, demanding whine. She begged me to give Julian the money to flee the country. She screamed that I had millions in liquid assets, that my company could easily swallow a massive deficit to cover his immediate warrants and secure his escape route. She demanded I fund his flight, insisting that if I just cleared his name for 24 hours, the ceremony could proceed as planned. "Just let me have this one day," she wailed, shaking my arms violently. "You have so much money. You are my sister. Just fix it." I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no pity left in my system, no lingering familial obligation, just pure crystalline ice. I forcefully peeled her fingers off my wrists and took a deliberate step back, wiping my hands on my tailored blazer, as if removing a toxic stain. "I don't clean up your messes anymore," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the massive suite. Chloe's desperate sobbing instantly morphed into vicious, unadulterated rage. The realization that I was not going to save her shattered her fragile facade. If she was going down, she was determined to drag me into the fire with her. She stepped forward, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She demanded her cut of my wealth, claiming she was legally entitled to half of my estate as my sister. She threatened to call every major news outlet and financial publication in the country by sunrise. She swore she would spread vicious rumors about my business practices, accusing Apex Estate Management of corruption and destroying my corporate reputation unless I wired the funds immediately. I smiled, a slow, calculated expression of absolute victory. I raised my hand and pointed casually to the small blinking red light of the security camera mounted discreetly in the ceiling corner of the VIP suite. "I don't clean up your messes anymore," I repeated softly. "But you should probably check your own bank accounts, Chloe. Julian had you sign as a co-guarantor on his fraudulent loans. Are you trying to extort a corporate CEO on tape, Chloe? Because my lawyers would love to add blackmail to Julian's impending federal indictment." Chloe stared at the blinking red light, the realization of her recorded felony piercing her hysteria. Pale and horrified, she sprinted down the corridor. I watched her flee, feeling only closure. The sun rose on the morning of the wedding, illuminating the sprawling, luxury coastal resort Julian had booked. The venue, a glass pavilion overlooking the Pacific, bustled with frantic, unaware guests. Delivery trucks unloaded white roses, while hospitality staff rushed between tents, completely ignorant that the groom was currently dealing with federal agents instead of writing vows. Upstairs in the bridal suite, the atmosphere was thick with clinical denial. Chloe sat rigidly, heavily medicated and clutching champagne. Her glazed eyes stared ahead as she forced the makeup artists to get her ready, barking vicious orders about her contour. She was trapped in a psychotic delusion, verbally assuring everyone that Julian was simply handling a minor banking error and would be waiting at the altar. She truly believed that if she just put on the designer gown, the reality of his criminal indictment would magically vanish. Helen and Thomas were fiercely guarding the bridal suite doors. They frantically intercepted early guests, pushing the desperate narrative that Chloe was just experiencing standard wedding jitters. They smiled tightly, deflecting questions about the absence of Julian. Their desperation was palpable. Having mortgaged their entire existence on this wedding, they were willing to uphold the delusion until the last possible second. I stepped onto the penthouse floor, flanked by my corporate attorney. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood echoing down the hallway. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek briefcase. I was not there for Chloe. I was there to execute a hostile takeover. Helen spotted me instantly, her forced smile vanishing entirely into panic. She nudged Thomas, who stepped forward to physically block the hallway, puffing out his chest to project an authority he no longer possessed. "You are not going near her, Maya," he demanded in a trembling whisper. "She is getting ready for the most important moment of her life. Turn around before I call resort security." Helen flanked him defensively. "We are not letting you ruin this day," she hissed. "Julian is on his way. You will not destroy your sister's happiness." I did not even break my stride. I looked directly at them with absolute freezing indifference. "I am not here for Chloe," I stated flatly, my voice cutting through the quiet corridor. "And I am certainly not here for you. You can continue playing games in your fantasy world for as long as you like. I have a scheduled business meeting." I bypassed them effortlessly, stepping around my father's rigid frame without a second glance. Thomas reached out as if to grab my arm, but my attorney simply cleared his throat, offering a warning glare that made my father instantly retract his hand. They watched in stunned silence as I walked straight past the bridal suite and approached the large, heavy mahogany doors at the very end of the hall, the private executive boardroom. I pushed the doors open to find Marcus Sterling, the primary owner of the coastal resort, sitting at the head of a long conference table. He looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Marcus was a legendary real estate developer, but he had severely overleveraged his assets over the past 2 years. His hospitality empire was drowning in debt, and his creditors were circling. He urgently needed a massive infusion of liquidity, and he needed it today. "Maya," he said, standing up and offering a nervous, eager handshake. "I have the closing documents ready. My legal team has reviewed your final offer." I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, opening my briefcase. My attorney slid the finalized acquisition contracts across the polished wood. Apex Estate Management was not just auditing this event. We were buying the entire resort. I had spent the last month quietly negotiating a complete buyout of the hospitality portfolio using my personal tech investments. Marcus was desperate enough to accept a fraction of its market value to avoid bankruptcy. "This property will undergo a complete rebranding under the Apex umbrella," I stated calmly, uncapping my fountain pen. "We will be retaining the ground staff, but upper management will be replaced by Tuesday. I expect a seamless transition." Marcus nodded rapidly, his relief palpable. "Of course, Maya. Whatever you need. The transfer of ownership is effective immediately upon your signature." I leaned forward, the expensive pen hovering over the signature line. The satisfaction of this moment was quiet but profound. My family was just down the hall, desperately clinging to a fraudulent illusion of wealth, while I was literally buying the ground beneath their feet. I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name with precise, deliberate strokes. I stamped the corporate seal, finalizing the massive estate acquisition. The heavy mahogany executive boardroom doors swung open. The resort general estate manager stepped into the room holding a red folder. He looked incredibly pale, his eyes darting between Marcus and me. He cleared his throat nervously, stepping up to the edge of the conference table. "Excuse me for interrupting the meeting," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "But I was just informed that the ownership transition is complete. I need to bring an urgent matter to the new owner's attention immediately." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "Go ahead," I instructed. The manager opened the red folder, his hands visibly shaking. "Ma'am," he began, swallowing hard. "The groom final payment for the premium catering, the imported floral arrangements, and the string orchestra was processed an hour ago. The bank just rejected the wire transfer. The funds bounced completely. We are entirely uncompensated for this event. Do we cancel the entire wedding ceremony right now?" He nervously waited for my direct command. I smiled, leaning forward as I considered my options. "Excellent. Let the chaos begin. Do not cancel anything yet," I instructed the estate manager, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Allow the vendors to finish their setup, but lock the main ballroom doors. Apex Estate Management will assume all outstanding invoices for this event, but Julian and Chloe are not to be informed of this arrangement. Let them sweat." I left the executive boardroom and made my way up to the penthouse suite I had secured for myself. It was time to prepare for the afternoon, and I had something very specific in mind to wear. Waiting for me in my private dressing room was a custom $50,000 gown. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk and hand-stitched Swarovski crystals gifted to me by Laurent, a legendary Parisian designer whose sprawling countryside chateau I had saved from a vicious corporate liquidation the previous year. He had spent 6 months personally crafting the garment for me, tailoring it to my exact measurements. I opened the heavy oak door to my suite and stopped dead in my tracks. The pristine white garment bag lay crumpled on the Persian rug. The velvet hanger was empty. The gown was gone. I did not need to launch an investigation to figure out who the thief was. I turned around and walked briskly down the corridor toward the secondary dressing rooms, following the muffled sounds of frantic shouting and a sewing machine running at maximum speed. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the bridal prep room and witnessed a scene of absolute desecration. Chloe was standing on a velvet pedestal wearing my midnight blue gown. The dress had been designed to drape elegantly over my frame, but Chloe had forcefully squeezed herself into it, straining the delicate silk seams to their absolute breaking point. A terrified local seamstress was kneeling at Chloe's feet, weeping silently as she hacked away at the flawless crystal hem with a pair of cheap fabric shears. Chloe had already ripped the custom designer tags out of the collar and tossed them onto the floor like garbage. "Hem it higher!" Chloe snapped at the trembling woman, completely ignoring my entrance. "Julian is going to be waiting at the altar in 30 minutes, and I refuse to trip over this stupid fabric. Just cut it off." "Where is the dress you actually purchased, Chloe?" I asked, my voice cutting through her manic delusion like a scythe. Chloe flinched, her eyes darting toward the mirror. She looked completely feral. The heavy medication she had taken to calm her nerves was clearly clashing with her pure panic. "The boutique sent a representative this morning," she spat out, refusing to look at me. "They claim Julian's final payment bounced. They actually repossessed my wedding dress right off the mannequin. It is just a bank error. Julian is fixing it right now. But I need something to wear down the aisle, and this fits perfectly well enough." She was entirely untethered from reality. Her fiancé was currently facing federal indictment. His offshore accounts were frozen by the government, and the catering staff had not been paid. Yet her only concern was marching down an aisle toward a man who was actively trying to flee the country to avoid prison. Helen rushed forward, positioning herself between me and the pedestal like a guard dog protecting a rabid animal. She crossed her arms, her face contorted with that familiar, sickeningly toxic entitlement she had wielded my entire life. "Do not start a fight right now, Maya," Helen warned, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. "Your sister is under an immense amount of stress. You can easily afford to buy another dress tomorrow. Look at her. She needs to look like royalty today. Julian's family is expecting absolute perfection, and this gown is the only thing salvaging this morning. You will let her wear it. We are not letting you ruin your sister's special day just because you are jealous." I looked from Helen's defiant glare to the seamstress who was literally butchering a priceless piece of haute couture fashion. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not waste a single breath trying to reason with people who had built their entire existence on theft and delusion. I calmly reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my contacts. I tapped the video call icon next to Laurent's name. As one of my most exclusive clients, he always answered my calls directly. The screen connected after 2 rings, revealing Laurent sitting in his Paris atelier, surrounded by sketches. "Maya, my darling," Laurent greeted warmly, his thick French accent echoing from the phone speaker. "Are you calling to show me the gown I have been waiting all week to see how the silk catches the natural light?" "I am calling to show you the gown, Laurent," I replied evenly. "But unfortunately, it is currently being worn by an unauthorized individual." I turned my phone screen directly toward the pedestal. I made sure the high-definition camera captured every horrifying detail. I showed him Chloe shoving her arms through the strained bodice, the ripped seams along the zipper, and the seamstress actively hacking away at the crystal-embellished hem with metal scissors. Laurent let out a visceral shriek of pure, unadulterated horror. He dropped his coffee cup, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson as he stared at the screen. He was witnessing his archival one-of-a-kind masterpiece being slaughtered in real time. "What is this atrocity?" Laurent screamed, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. Who is this uncultured farm animal destroying my silk? That fabric is irreplaceable. Stop her immediately. Chloe stared at the phone screen, the blood draining from her face as she finally recognized the legendary fashion icon screaming at her. She froze the scissors, pausing mid-snip. I cannot physically stop them, Laurent, I said smoothly, keeping the camera trained on my sister's terrified face. They believe they are entitled to it. Entitled! Laurent roared, slamming his hands onto his desk. I sent my regional head of security to your resort this morning to deliver the matching sapphire accessories to the front desk. He is in the lobby right now. I am dispatching him to your exact location. He barked a rapid command in French to someone off camera, his eyes burning with lethal intent. Nobody desecrates my art. Nobody. He terminated the call. The room plunged into a suffocating, terrified silence. Helen lowered her arm, her false bravado instantly evaporating. Chloe looked down at the dress, suddenly realizing she had not just stolen a piece of clothing, she had committed a crime against a billionaire fashion mogul. Less than 2 minutes later, the door to the dressing room crashed open. 4 massive men in identical black suits stormed into the room. They were Laurent's private elite security detail, and they operated with terrifying mechanical efficiency. The lead guard flashed a titanium badge at Helen, forcing her back against the wall while the other 3 surrounded the pedestal. Remove the garment immediately, the head of security commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. Or we will physically cut it off you. Chloe let out a high-pitched sob of pure humiliation. The seamstress scrambled backward, terrified out of her mind. With trembling, frantic hands, Chloe reached behind her back and unzipped the ruined silk. The security guards did not offer her a robe or a towel. They simply ripped the midnight blue fabric down her arms, pulling the precious material away from her sweating body. They folded the desecrated gown with reverent care, placed it into a secure lockbox, and marched out of the room in perfect unison, without uttering another word. I stood in the doorway staring at the ruins of my family. Chloe was left standing on the velvet pedestal in nothing but her nude bridal shapewear and sheer tights, shivering violently as the reality of her total destruction finally set in. It was exactly 30 minutes before her wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. The scramble to clothe the bride was a masterclass in pathetic desperation. Helen frantically raided the bridesmaids' dressing rooms, returning with a heavily discounted polyester gown that was originally intended as a simple backup reception dress. It lacked the structure, the hand-stitched crystals, and the pedigree of Laurent's masterpiece. The cheap fabric clung awkwardly to Chloe, wrinkling across her midsection and pooling ungracefully at her feet. She looked absolutely nothing like the billionaire heiress she had been pretending to be for the past year. She looked like a woman who was entirely out of time and out of options. Yet she allowed Helen to blindly pin a veil to her hair, plastering a manic, terrified smile onto her face. The delusion was absolute. Outside the bridal suite, the massive glass pavilion overlooking the Pacific Ocean was filled to capacity. The brilliant afternoon sun highlighted the stark contrast between the pristine floral arrangements and the toxic tension suffocating the room. 300 high society guests sat in gilded chairs, fanning themselves with custom-printed programs. The whispers were already circulating like a localized virus. People were leaning across the aisles, exchanging sharp, knowing glances. The pristine veneer of the Kensington wedding was cracking right before their eyes. At the altar, Julian looked exactly like a cornered animal, calculating his final escape route. He shifted his weight from side to side, repeatedly running a trembling hand through his slicked hair. His custom tuxedo, which had looked impeccably sharp just hours ago at the rehearsal dinner, now appeared rumpled and suffocatingly tight. Heavy beads of sweat formed a thick sheen across his forehead, catching the bright sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling. He was not looking down the aisle toward his impending bride. His panicked eyes darted continuously toward the side exits of the pavilion, checking his expensive watch every few seconds. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, desperately waiting for the lever to be pulled. I took my designated seat in the front row directly across the aisle from the groom's side. Eleanor Kensington sat completely rigid to my left, wrapped in a dark cashmere shawl despite the afternoon heat. She had adopted a mask of pure, impenetrable stone. She did not acknowledge the whispering guests. She did not acknowledge the elaborate floral displays, and she certainly did not acknowledge her son standing at the altar. She was merely present to witness the execution, preserving her own elite reputation by physically distancing herself from his impending downfall. The string quartet finally struck the opening chords of the bridal march. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the pavilion groaned open, revealing Chloe and our father. A collective suppressed gasp rippled through the audience. The guests were expecting a couture vision of wealth. Instead, they saw a bride in a wrinkled, off-the-rack polyester dress, her eyes wide with unblinking, medicated panic. They began their slow, excruciating march down the white-carpeted aisle. Every step felt heavy, burdened by the unspoken lies and financial ruin threatening to crush them. As they approached the front row, Thomas turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with a mixture of desperate authority and deep-seated resentment. He leaned slightly toward my direction, his jaw clenched tight. Without making a sound, he mouthed the words, "Don't ruin this." He still believed he was in control. He still believed this wedding would somehow erase the catastrophic debts they had accumulated. I did not break his gaze. I reached down, calmly picked up my glass of chilled sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I offered him a flat, unreadable smile. I did not need to ruin anything. They had already done the work for me. Thomas surrendered Chloe's hand to Julian at the altar. Julian barely looked at her. He practically snatched her hand, pulling her into position with a frantic, aggressive energy. His grip was tight enough to make Chloe wince, but she maintained her frozen, terrifying smile, staring blindly at the man who was about to drag her down into a federal indictment. The officiant, a dignified older man who seemed completely oblivious to the criminal tension vibrating between the couple, opened his leather-bound binder. He began the traditional welcoming remarks, speaking slowly and deliberately about the sanctity of marriage and the lifelong commitment of love. Julian was practically vibrating out of his skin. He shifted his stance again, his eyes darting to a pair of security guards standing near the pavilion's rear entrance. He needed this marriage legalized immediately. I knew exactly what he was calculating. Spousal privilege was a powerful legal shield. If Chloe became his legal wife before the federal marshals arrived, they could not compel her to testify against him regarding the fraudulent loan documents he had forced her to sign. Furthermore, he needed to secure legal access to whatever pristine credit lines she still possessed. He was cut off from the Kensington wealth, and Chloe was his only remaining ticket to an offshore flight. He needed her signature to drain whatever remaining equity they could leverage before the banks completely locked them out of the system forever. "Can we speed this up?" Julian hissed, interrupting the officiant mid-sentence. His voice was harsh, carrying over the quiet pavilion. "Skip the poetry. Just get to the vows. We have a reception to get to." A stunned murmur spread through the front rows. Chloe let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle, trying to play off his desperate rudeness as an eager joke. The officiant blinked, clearly offended, but the frantic look in Julian's eyes made him adjust his posture and quickly flip past 2 pages of his binder. "Very well," the officiant said, clearing his throat and recovering his professional tone. "Marriage is a bond that requires absolute honesty and unwavering trust." He looked out over the assembled crowd, his voice projecting through the pavilion's sound system. "Therefore, if anyone here objects to this union or knows any reason why these two should not be lawfully wed." He paused, letting the traditional silence hang in the air for a mere second. Julian opened his mouth to say his vows before the question was even finished, desperate to force the verbal contract through before the charade imploded. "Speak now or forever hold your peace." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel burst open. The violent crash of mahogany severed the silence of the pavilion. Reality arrived as dark windbreakers, tactical vests, and federal badges. It was not me objecting to this fraudulent union. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation operating in full coordination with the Internal Revenue Service. A dozen armed agents flooded the immaculate space, ignoring the white floral arrangements as they marched in synchronized formation down the aisle. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, yielding to the heavy thud of tactical boots against the polished floorboards. A collective gasp from 300 guests sucked the oxygen out of the room. Elite socialites scrambled backward in their gilded chairs, pulling their garments out of the aisle. The Kensington wedding shattered into irreparable pieces. The illusion was dead. At the altar, Julian stopped sweating and went completely pale. His frantic calculations ceased. The trapdoor had swung wide open. He took one hesitant step toward the side exit, but two agents had already flanked the altar, cutting off his escape. The lead agent stepped directly onto the velvet dais. He did not care about the sanctity of the altar. He did not wait for the officiant to step aside. He reached into his jacket, pulled out steel handcuffs, and grabbed Julian by the shoulder, spinning the groom around with brutal force. "Julian Kensington, you are under arrest!" The agent's voice boomed over the unmuted microphone clipped to the officiant's lapel. "The charges are wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and attempting to flee federal prosecution. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the pavilion sound system. Julian did not fight back. He simply sagged, his expensive tuxedo crumpling as the reality of a decade behind bars crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. The wealthy guests erupted into a chaotic frenzy of whispers. Cell phones were whipped out to document the spectacular downfall of the Kensington heir. I remained perfectly still in my front row seat watching the execution. I glanced to my left to observe Eleanor. She had not moved a single muscle. Her posture was rigidly perfect. As the agents yanked her son's arms behind his back, she slowly lowered her chin in a single deliberate nod of approval. She was severing the infected limb to save her empire. Julian was a liability, and Eleanor only traded in assets. Chloe stood frozen just feet away, her mouth hanging open in silent terror. The cheap polyester backup dress clung to her sweating frame, the veil sliding askew on her head. She looked completely pathetic, a fraudulent princess watching her castle burn to the ground. She took a shaky step toward Julian, reaching out a trembling hand, as if she could pull him back into her psychotic delusion. Before her fingers could even brush his sleeve, a female IRS agent stepped directly into her path. The agent's gaze swept over Chloe's wrinkled discount gown with profound professional indifference. "Chloe Adams," the agent stated, her voice crisp and clear. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest." Chloe recoiled as if she had been struck. She shook her head violently, the cheap veil slipping off and landing on the floor. "No," she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "You are making a mistake. I did not do anything. I am the bride. It is a mistake. Julian, tell them it is a bank error." Julian refused to look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floorboards as the agents began to march him away. "There is no mistake, Ms. Adams," the female agent continued, retrieving a second pair of handcuffs from her belt. "You are being indicted for criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated tax evasion. Your signature is on 34 separate fraudulent loan applications and offshore shell company transfers. Put your hands behind your back." The color drained from Chloe's face. The federal government did not care about her wedding day. They only cared about the paper trail, and Chloe had willingly signed her name to every single piece of Julian's financial ruin. She let out a piercing scream, thrashing her arms wildly as the agent stepped forward. "Mom," Chloe wailed, twisting her head to look wildly at the front row. "Dad, do something. Do not let them take me. Tell them who we are." Thomas could not handle the public humiliation. His entire identity was built on projecting dominance. Seeing his favorite daughter being treated like a common criminal in front of 300 elite guests broke his restraint. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tie, and marched out of the front pew. He stepped onto the altar, puffing himself up to his maximum height, attempting to wield an authority he had not legitimately possessed in over a decade. "Excuse me," Thomas boomed, pointing a rigid finger directly at the lead FBI agent. "I am Thomas Adams. This is my daughter, and this is a private family event. You are ruining the most important day of her life based on a clerical error. I demand that you unhand her immediately and leave this property before I call my legal team and sue your entire department for harassment." The lead agent paused. He did not look intimidated. He looked mildly amused. He slowly reached into his pocket and retrieved a folded clipboard, flipping past the top sheet of paper. He ran his finger down a printed list, completely ignoring Thomas's posturing. Thomas Adams, the agent repeated, looking up from the clipboard with freezing, predatory focus. That is incredibly convenient. We do not need you to call your legal team, Mr. Adams. We need to speak with you directly. Please place your hands where I can see them. We have a myriad of questions regarding the fraudulent second mortgage you recently secured on your Brooklyn property. Thomas staggered backward, as if physically struck by the federal agent's heavy clipboard. His patriarchal dominance and completely manufactured authority drained from his rigid posture in a single second. He opened his mouth to formulate a defense, perhaps another desperate lie about banking errors, but his vocal cords utterly failed him. The federal agent did not wait. He quietly signaled a subordinate who stepped forward and read my father his Miranda rights right there on the white carpeted aisle. The sheer unadulterated visual of Thomas Adams being detained ignited the immediate powder keg. Panic swept through the transparent glass pavilion like a sudden localized hurricane. 300 wealthy, high society guests, people who guarded their social reputations much more fiercely than their actual lives, realized simultaneously that they were currently sitting in the middle of an active federal crime scene. A massive, frantic stampede of expensive silk, imported chiffon, and tailored bespoke suits surged aggressively toward the rear pavilion exits. Absolutely nobody wanted to be photographed by the ravenous press that was undoubtedly gathering outside the resort's main gates. Nobody wanted their family names permanently associated with a massive federal indictment for corporate wire fraud. They shoved violently past each other, abandoning embossed wedding programs and half-empty crystal champagne flutes, completely trampling the imported white roses lining the center aisle. Helen was left standing completely alone in the front row, watching her universe vaporize. She looked at Julian being marched toward the side exit. She looked at Thomas, whose hands were secured behind his back. Then her gaze landed on Chloe. The sight of her golden child shivering in a cheap polyester dress with steel locked around her wrists was the final blow. Helen dropped to her knees right there on the hardwood floor. A guttural wail ripped from her throat. Her meticulously crafted social image, the facade she prioritized over her own flesh and blood, was destroyed forever. Chloe thrashed against the grip of the female IRS agent. Her medicated stupor had worn off, replaced by raw rage. She twisted her neck, her wild eyes scanning the front rows until they locked onto me. I was still sitting calmly beside Eleanor, holding my glass of sparkling water. "You did this!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through the pavilion. "You called the feds on us. You set us up because you were jealous. You have always been jealous of me. Tell them to stop. Maya, tell them you made it all up." Julian dug his heels into the floorboards and jerked his head toward the arresting officers. "She is lying," Julian shouted, spit flying from his lips. "Maya is the mastermind. She audits hospitality portfolios. She set up the shell companies. Chloe and I do not even know how to run a wire transfer. Check her accounts. Check her hard drives. She framed us to execute a hostile takeover of my family's estate. They were cornered rats attempting to bite the closest target. They truly believed that if they screamed loud enough, they could drag me down into the federal prison system with them. It was a pathetic strategy entirely characteristic of people who had never taken accountability for a single action in their entire lives. I did not dignify their frantic accusations with a verbal response. I simply gestured toward the side aisle. Stepping seamlessly out from the shadows of the grand pillars was my corporate legal team. 3 attorneys in immaculate charcoal suits walked directly toward the lead FBI agent. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace that made Julian's shouting immediately cease. My lead attorney approached the federal agent and handed him a pristine leather-bound binder. It was a comprehensive 500-page dossier. I had spent the last 2 months using my auditing firm's resources to meticulously track every fraudulent transaction Julian and Chloe had executed. The binder contained bank statements, offshore routing numbers, IP addresses from Julian's personal laptops, and forged signatures verified by handwriting experts. It also contained irrefutable time-stamped proof that neither I nor Eleanor Kensington had any financial association with their shell companies. The lead agent flipped open the heavy binder, his eyes scanning the executive summaries. A slow, appreciative nod indicated he understood exactly what he was holding. He looked at Julian, who was now trembling uncontrollably, and then back at my attorney. "This is exceptionally thorough," the agent noted, securing the binder under his arm. "This clears the Kensington matriarch and Apex Estate Management of any pending investigatory holds. We appreciate the cooperation." Eleanor Kensington, sitting right beside me, did not flinch. She smoothed the fabric of her skirt, her expression radiating cold, aristocratic satisfaction. She had legally amputated her son, and my dossier was the scalpel. As the agents began dragging Julian, Chloe, and Thomas toward the back exits to process their arrests, the silence in the pavilion became absolute. The guests were gone. The only sound left was the quiet lapping of the Pacific Ocean against the resort's foundation. Helen was still on the floor, her makeup completely ruined by a cascade of black tears. She watched her husband and favorite daughter being hauled away in handcuffs. The reality of their inescapable ruin crashed over her. They had no money. Thomas's accounts were frozen. Julian's assets were seized. They were facing millions in restitution and years in federal prison. Helen slowly turned her head and looked at me. The condescension, the superiority, the lifetime of treating me like an inconvenient outsider vanished. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive silk dress tearing against the floorboards. She practically crawled across the aisle until she reached my chair. Her trembling, frantic hands reached out and clamped onto the hem of my tailored charcoal skirt in a gesture of absolute pathetic desperation. "Please, Maya!" Helen wailed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You have the money. You bought this resort. You have to pay their bail. Buy them the best lawyers in the country. You can't let your family go to prison." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. Helen was a crumpled, trembling mess of ruined silk and smeared cosmetics. Her manicured fingers, the same hands that had dismissively waved away my achievements for 3 decades, were now gripping the fabric of my tailored skirt with white-knuckled desperation. She was begging for salvation from the very daughter she had spent a lifetime trying to erase. I stared into her panicked, bloodshot eyes and searched my chest for a reaction. I waited for a surge of vindictive rage, a flash of lingering sorrow, or even a fleeting spark of familial pity. I found absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy had run completely dry. There was no anger left, no sadness to process. I felt only a profound, echoing emptiness that quickly solidified into absolute freezing clarity. "Buy them lawyers," I repeated, my voice cutting cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. The words bounced off the towering glass walls of the pavilion, ringing over the rows of abandoned gilded chairs and the scattered debris of the ruined ceremony. "Yes," Helen gasped, her chest heaving as she tried to pull herself up, using my legs as leverage. "Maya, please. You are the only one who can fix this. You have the capital. They will lock your father away. They will ruin your sister." I looked at her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see a desperate, pathetic flicker of hope ignite in her wet eyes. She truly thought I was yielding. She actually believed that the toxic, one-sided bond she had exploited for my entire existence was finally going to compel me to save her. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face level with hers, maintaining my sterile detachment. "I am sorry, Mom," I said, my tone perfectly conversational. But as Dad so eloquently announced to the entire room at the engagement dinner, I just clean houses. The flicker of hope in her eyes died, instantly replaced by a dark, sinking realization. "And right now," I continued, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper, "I am taking out the trash." I did not wait for her response. I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my charcoal skirt, peeling them away one by one. I stepped back, smoothing out the minor wrinkles she had left in the fabric. Helen collapsed entirely, her forehead pressing against the hardwood floor, as a fresh wave of guttural, hopeless wailing tore from her throat. I turned my back on her without a second glance. Eleanor Kensington was waiting for me near the rear entrance of the pavilion. She stood perfectly upright, adjusting the drape of her cashmere shawl. We did not exchange a verbal greeting. We simply shared a brief, knowing nod. We were two women who had successfully excised the terminal cancer from our respective lives. We turned together and walked out of the glass chapel, our heels clicking in perfect unison against the floorboards, stepping effortlessly over the crushed white roses and discarded wedding programs that littered the aisle. We emerged from the pavilion into the bright, salty air of the Pacific coast. The immaculate circular driveway of the luxury resort had been transformed into an active federal staging ground. A fleet of dark SUVs with flashing red and blue lights blocked the main gates. Uniformed agents and tactical officers swarmed the perimeter, securing the area, while terrified wedding guests scrambled toward the valet stand, hiding their faces behind designer clutch purses to avoid the cameras. I paused at the top of the stone steps, watching the final act of the tragedy unfold. Julian was being forcefully shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle, his head pushed down by an agent. His custom tuxedo jacket was ripped at the shoulder seam, his face pale and slick with terrified sweat. Across the driveway, Chloe was actively resisting arrest. She kicked violently at a female IRS agent, screaming a string of unhinged obscenities. Her cheap, off-the-rack polyester dress had hiked up her thighs, the fabric stained with dirt from the pavement. The agent simply pinned her against the side of the cruiser, secured her wrists with zip ties, and forced her into the back seat. Thomas was the last to be loaded. He did not fight. He walked with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, his manufactured patriarchal dominance completely shattered by the reality of federal handcuffs. Eleanor's private chauffeur stood waiting beside a phantom black Rolls-Royce, holding the heavy rear door open. Eleanor stepped inside first, settling into the plush leather interior. I took one last look at the flashing lights and the frantic chaos of my ruined family, feeling a profound sense of closure. I stepped into the car, and the chauffeur securely closed the door, instantly silencing the sirens and the screaming. The interior of the vehicle was a sanctuary of climate-controlled silence. As the Rolls-Royce glided smoothly down the manicured driveway, bypassing the barricade of federal vehicles, I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer. My phone vibrated with a sharp, singular pulse. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. It was an urgent, encrypted notification from my lead property manager. I opened the secure document attached to the message. The bank had officially processed the final foreclosure and transfer paperwork. The fraudulent second mortgage Thomas had taken out to fund Chloe's extravagant lifestyle had been entirely wiped from the ledger. The deed to the historic Brooklyn brownstone, the home Big Mama had painstakingly built, and the only piece of my childhood that held any pure memories, was now fully transferred. It was legally registered entirely under my private corporate LLC. I owned the property outright, free and clear. Thomas and Helen had zero remaining legal claim to the estate. The generational theft had been reversed. I locked my phone screen, leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest, and watched the coastal highway blur past the tinted window. The purge was finally complete. 30 days later, the dust settled over the wreckage of the Addams family, leaving a landscape of absolute devastation. The federal justice system moved with a swift, merciless efficiency that Julian and Chloe had never anticipated. Julian was immediately denied bail. The presiding judge deemed him a severe flight risk, citing the offshore accounts my dossier had meticulously outlined. He was currently sitting in a miserable federal detention center, trading his custom-tailored Italian suits for a scratchy standard-issue orange jumpsuit, staring down a mandatory minimum of 15 excruciating years for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Eleanor's legal team had surgically separated Apex Estate Management from his crimes, leaving him completely exposed and utterly alone. Chloe, however, narrowly managed to post bail, though it completely drained every single remaining liquid asset she possessed. She walked out of the holding facility, completely broke, publicly disgraced, and universally shunned by the elite social circles she had spent years trying to infiltrate. Her offshore bank accounts were entirely frozen, her platinum credit lines were instantly revoked, and she was facing her own severe federal charges for criminal conspiracy and massive tax evasion. The ruthless high society blogs that once endlessly praised her lavish engagement were now viciously publishing daily exposés on her entirely fraudulent lifestyle. She was nothing more than a tragic ghost haunting the morning tabloids. The collateral damage extended far beyond the failed bride and groom. Helen and Thomas faced a brutal reckoning of their own. Their meticulously crafted social standing imploded overnight. The prestigious elite community church they had proudly attended for decades, the very institution where they had arrogantly paraded their fake wealth and harshly judged everyone beneath them, officially and publicly excommunicated them. The church board cited moral turpitude and financial misconduct, swiftly removing Thomas from the deacon council and banning Helen from the women's auxiliary. They became pariahs in their own community. But the ultimate inescapable consequence arrived via sterile certified mail from my corporate management company. When Thomas fraudulently leveraged the Brooklyn brownstone to fund Chloe's wedding, he fundamentally violated the strict terms of the lease agreement I had established. That violation triggered an immediate, non-negotiable eviction clause. I did not handle the paperwork myself. Instead, I deliberately let my elite legal team seamlessly execute the eviction with cold, clinical precision, treating my parents exactly like the desperate, delinquent, fraudulent tenants they had repeatedly proven themselves to be. They were given exactly 14 days to vacate the premises. I chose to oversee their departure in person. I arrived at the Brooklyn brownstone on a crisp, overcast Tuesday morning. The quiet, tree-lined street looked exactly as it had during my childhood, but the energy had completely shifted. A dented rented U-Haul truck sat idling in the driveway, a stark contrast to the luxury sedans that used to line the curb. I stood on the cracked sidewalk, my hands buried deeply in the pockets of my wool coat, silently watching the scene unfold. Thomas and Helen were physically dragging cardboard boxes out the front door. They looked aged, exhausted, and now thoroughly broken. Helen's blonde hair was unstyled, her designer clothes replaced by faded sweatpants. Thomas was sweating profusely, struggling to lift a heavy crate of cheap kitchenware onto the truck ramp. They had no movers, they had no staff, they had absolutely nobody left to order around. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. Thomas dropped the crate he was holding and turned to face me. His chest heaved with exertion, but his eyes were still dark with that familiar toxic resentment. Helen emerged from the doorway holding a framed photograph. When she saw me standing on the porch, she stopped dead in her tracks. The air between us was thick with the weight of 30 years of lies, manipulation, and conditional love. They had expected me to fold. They had expected me to rescue them at the 11th hour. They simply could not process that the daughter they had treated like a disposable asset was now the architect of their complete ruin. Thomas took a step forward, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He tried to straighten his posture, attempting to summon a ghost of his former authority. He looked at the brownstone, then at the U-Haul, and finally at me. His jaw clenched, his face turning a deep shade of red. Helen stepped up beside him, clutching the framed photograph to her chest as if it were a shield. "You planned this from the very beginning." Thomas growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound defeat. "You bought this house just to kick us out onto the street. You handed your own sister over to the federal government. You destroyed Julian. You destroyed our reputation. You destroyed this entire family." Helen stepped closer, tears welling in her eyes, trying to leverage the motherly guilt she had weaponized my entire life. "How can you stand there and watch us load a truck?" Helen cried, her voice cracking. "We raised you. We gave you everything, and you threw your own blood to the wolves." I looked at the two people who had systematically tried to erase my worth to elevate their favored child. I looked at the U-Haul that held the meager remains of their fraudulent life. I felt the familiar weight of Big Mama's legacy standing solid and secure behind me. No, I replied, my voice calm, steady, and utterly void of empathy. I just stopped being the sheep. I turned my back on them and walked past their trembling figures. I stepped over the threshold of the brownstone, grasping the brass handles of the heavy oak doors. I pulled them shut with a definitive, resounding thud. I engaged the deadbolt, sliding the heavy brass lock into place. The sound echoed through the empty foyer, signaling the absolute end of their reign. I had finally secured my ancestral legacy.